Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jazmín Morales. I am the Assistant Director of the Center for Innovation and Community Impact at the Colburn School here in Los Angeles, California. And it is my honor to actively moderate this session, Where the Wild Things Are. I'm joined here by an illustrious group of colleagues, starting with David Stull, the President of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. Thank you for joining us, David. Lee Bynum, the Vice President of Impact at the Minnesota Opera. Thank you, Lee, for joining us.
Thank you.
And Yuval Sharon, the founder and artistic director of the industry. Thank you, Yuval, for joining us.
Very glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Yes. So in today's conversation, first of all, I have to say that we are a group of wild things here. In our prep discussions, it became very clear why this particular group was assembled. We have a lot of interesting things cooking in our areas, and we are so excited to share them with you all. And I want to start with this term wild, which as our panelists were sharing right before we came on, is such an apt word to describe what we have lived through over the last 2 years. It really has felt like a wild ride, and in some ways has demanded some wild ideas in response. And so today we're really here to talk about what those ideas are, how the process of creating and advancing those ideas within our institutions and in our practices, how to partner with others in order to strengthen those ideas and outcomes for the better. So with that, let's dive right in. And I want to start with Yuval, because Yuval, the New York Times called you the disruptor in residence. So I figured you'd be the perfect person to kick us off in discussing the question, what does it mean to be wild from your vantage point? How are you making new wild decisions in your practice?
Well, I would say that I think I have a view of opera itself, the art form that is really my métier. I think of that art form as inherently wild. It was an art form in which, as it was growing, became this meeting place of a lot of different artists that decided they were going to create something together. And if you think of the term opera, I like to say that the term opera translated to Italian, from Italian, just means work, because they don't really know what to call it. At the time, there were lots of different types of performance genres, whether they were equestrian ballets or whether they were oratorios or whether they whatever. But opera was not, a spoken drama. It certainly wasn't a spoken drama, but it was not a concert. It was a lot of not things, and then it was just had to be its own. Along the lines, it became somewhat institutionalized and tamed, if we want to think about a balance to the word wild. It became quite tamed, I think, for a while. And I certainly think that in America, we've been struggling with this kind of inheritance of what opera is about. It's, we still kind of perform the European repertoire as the core of what our companies do. But it's sort of, I see it as kind of like an ill-fitting suit, for who we could be, the kind of operas that could truly be ours. So I have been thinking, certainly my work with the industry in Los Angeles, but also during the pandemic with my recent appointment in Detroit at the Michigan Opera Theater. In both of those institutions, I've been looking to really push forward a notion of the wildness of opera, and one that can actually meet the wildness of our times. So in Detroit, we're just about to, I introduced myself to the Detroit audience with, I think, some projects that I think would be probably pretty well described as wild, in terms of being in parking garages, doing a kind of a drive-through opera as people went through our parking center, and to watch Wagner, to watch Twilight of the Gods as it went from level to level. Everyone staying in the safety of their own car. So that's kind of one example. But when we reopen the Detroit Opera House in April, I'll be staging La Boheme in reverse order. So starting with Act 4, going to Act 3, then doing Act 2, and ending with Act 1. And this is a very purposeful return to the theater, because we'll be starting with the tragedy of the story and ending with love and hope. And I hope that feels like it really relates to where we are right now as a society, that we have we're hopefully emerging from these 2 years of darkness and death and strife. And maybe in a way, the path forward is going to be one full of light and I think the youthfulness and really the wildness of Puccini's Bohemians, really trying to capture that, strip away a lot of the accumulated knowledge around Bohème, and actually try and get to that rambunctious core that I think is at the soul of it. In LA, somewhat similarly, we took the opportunity of the pandemic to diversify our leadership. So I went from being the sole artistic director to being one of 3 artistic directors. So we're now a artistic director cooperative, which is a really exciting, I like to say it's our biggest experiment yet for my company, because we are really trying to investigate new forms of leadership that might also, show a path forward for how we can all work together more and offer a lot of different perspectives on what the arts can offer us. So anyway, so I think that might be, that's kind of where my head is in terms of the trying to capture and harness the wildness of the times into the wildness of the work.
Absolutely beautiful. That's so exciting. I can't wait to see all of these projects materialize. And also, we'll be coming back to many of the things that you mentioned here. So thank you, Yuval, for that wonderful overview. Following in the world of opera, Lee Bynum, tell us how you are approaching this question. What does it mean to be wild from your particular vantage point as a VP of Impact within a larger opera institution?
Sure, thank you. So a lot of this for us is understanding and appreciating that these really are wild times, and especially here in the Twin Cities, where we are dealing with the twin crises of both producing during a pandemic, which is absolutely wild, and then also really negotiating how the racial equity conversation has sort of reframed everything it is that everyone is doing here in the Twin Cities. And I think the challenge for a company that produces the kind of work that we do is that most of us as individuals have spent much of our lives in practice rooms, right? And looking for precision and trying to express a mastery over our discipline. And suddenly we've been thrown into a new context where we can't quite get in front of anything very easily, right? So what I've tried to do is help the company overlay some structure that will allow us to ride the zeitgeist and not get bulldozed by it. So there are 4 areas where we've attempted to think differently about what we're doing and really try to center the values of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in our operations, in our programming, and our artistic work. And I'll mention these 4 sequential pieces really, really briefly. So first, we created a living document, a diversity charter that contours organizational culture over time. We use it to articulate the sort of workplace that we want to be with our key values put in front, right? And we use this alongside our statement of artistic purpose so that we are firmly situating these values in everything that we're doing. Secondly, we put into place diverse representation in the group that's deciding what gets produced. So similar to what Yuval mentioned, the work that is traditionally done by a sole artistic director at our company is shared by 4 people, the vice presidents of artistic, production, Impact, me, and our president. So this broader representation of perspectives with the greater diversity in terms of gender, race, sexual orientation, and artistic discipline is giving us a way to identify and circumvent organizational blind spots. Thirdly, we've defined our audience with more precision so that we have a clearer means of identifying the communities we would like to serve and the publics with which we are in conversation. So this has given our organizational capacity around maintaining substantive reciprocal relationships with different groups with which we partner, many more resources and more teeth to do that. And finally, we've acknowledged that the greatest tool that we have for community engagement is the music itself, right? So one of the things that we've done is been much more intentional about developing a bench of artistic talent. So we have started to develop much more substantive relationships with the groups that nourish underrepresented composers in particular. So in some instances, those are fellowship programs. In other instances, they are things like minority serving colleges and universities or community music schools. So the idea is that we are doing much, much more internally to support cohorts of composers, right? So whether these are cohorts of composers that are geographic or thematic or based on something demographic, right? Such that what we are doing is creating more thoughtful and fulsome relationships between the people who are creating the art and the organization itself. So I'll stop there, but that's a general outline of how we are trying to be less wild in these moments of complete wildness.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lee. Can't wait to get into that further. David, how about you? As a conservatory president, what does it mean to be wild?
Yeah, I think that name conservatory gets in the way of the perception of wild, or perhaps it amplifies the idea of wild. I mean, I think the reality is, you might imagine, the fundamental issue is maintaining, I think, a real sense of optimism in our students when they are faced with, at this age and this time of life, such crises. I mean, not just the crises we're seeing around equity and inclusion in our country, but also the crisis of a pandemic that shut down the profession, which already is so competitive and so difficult in the best of times. And for them, they're looking at a lens where, you know, they're at a very early age, 18 through 22 or 24. So the key was to try, I think, to really establish for them the fact that as hard as it is, they have to have an arc, a view of the world going forward. They can have an impact. They should drive that impact by optimism. And for us, being wild was doing things, frankly, that music schools typically don't do. One, I think at the top, the most overt one, I suppose, but our acquisition of Opus 3 artists. We did that in the middle of the pandemic. And I do have to say, you know, talking about brokering things, going to a board that's already looking at a budget that's millions in the red and saying, hey, look, I know we're spending all this money on Dante systems and supporting financial aid, but let's go buy a management company, was an interesting conversation in my career. But the point of doing that was multifaceted, but at a core of it was also that we saw these tremendous opportunities for an alliance to change the face of how artists are vetted. When we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, thinking about how can we use our resources to change the people that we see as stars across the world. We can do that as a school. We have that ability. We can lend this strength to them as they can lend their strength to us. We also thought about this as a mode of saying to our students, look, as we begin to invent the concert experience of tomorrow by using our school as a crucible to see how we present in the future, and experimenting with new ideas. And we have, by the way, extraordinary people as well to do that in real time. So I don't want to spend too much talking about that. But, you know, my job as the president is to create the conditions in which that kind of work can happen. And I think that from the standpoint of being wild, it's that I think the students are well aware that, wow, this seems risky. You know, the school is doing things in a time when most people are hunkering down that might feel wildly ambitious. And that was intentional. The intention was to, through example of our own behavior as faculty and as leadership, to say to our students, listen, these are difficult times or challenges before us, but let's turn these challenges into opportunities. You know, and I think for our students, everything from, you know, the emerging Black composers arrangement we have with the symphony, you know, this came out of a group of students and alumni. We're talking about how do we really redress DEI? We said, well, let's commission a work. We said, well, listen, how do we commission 10 works over 10 years? How do we do something that is a 10-year plan, not we've had a crisis in America, but if you look at historic crisis in America, there's a spike, there's a lot of activity, and then it goes back to flatline again. I mean, if we were honest about it historically. So a lot of us saying to our students, this goes to optimism, how do you make a change that by structural design is an enduring and change of importance? How do you make those kinds of choices? And in a way, though it shouldn't seem that way, I think that feels wild in our community in a strange way, because whether we admit it often or not, we can tend to be very conservative institutions. And taking those kinds of steps can seem wild. But I think one of the advantages we have is where we are in the world. At San Francisco, if we're not about innovation, what role should we play? So I suppose I see it as our role as in a center of innovation, as challenging as that is in the world, to try and take a leadership towards the most productive path we can. So those are some of the examples of what I would describe as wild over this last period of time.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. And I really couldn't agree with you more. Coming from the conservatory world myself, having that long-term vision, both for myself, helping students build that for themselves, and institutionally, I think is so important. And even though, yes, conservatories have been resistant historically to change, I think one thing that conservatories are really good at is sustaining legacy. And so if we're able to build in these wild ideas in a way that is sustainable in a long term, I think it's actually very aligned with the conservatory mindset in some way. So thank you for that, David. And I'll just share again from my end, being in a center for innovation within a conservatory in itself feels kind of like a wild construct. And certainly from my vantage point, to be wild means to think freely about what is possible, and not get stuck in the sort of just procedure and habit of how we run things day to day. And I think the last 2 years have all shown us such tremendous lessons in that area. But pulling a little further along this thread here, let's get into some process and strategy around how these changes have materialized. Lee, I want to go back to this amazing and robust plan that you laid out in Minnesota. How did you process and strategize and build community consensus around that to help materialize some of these ideas?
Sure. So perhaps sort of uniquely, the work started at Minnesota Opera about 6 years ago. So beginning in 2015, the company really started putting together a plan to embrace the demographic diversity of the Twin Cities and to start working really, really differently, right? And this started from the board level and moved organizationally through. So by the time I joined the company a year and a half ago, a lot of work had already happened in this regard, right? But the very key thing that I was brought in to do was to build out a department of impact, really to take on this work, right? So with our department, we have three sub-units within. One that's very much focused on looking at our internal processes, right, from an EDI standpoint. So there's a director of EDI that's looking at things like operations, policies, very much how we engage one another in a way that is not typical in the arts, right? It's really picking up a model that existed in academia and really reframing it for this space. Secondly, we have an area that's looking at community engagement and accessibility, really, really broadly drawn, right? So that we're really taking on how people experience the company, how the company is understood by its peers in the broader arts ecosystem here, and then how we are also showing up as a cultural anchor, right? So beyond just what we are producing on stage, what kind of a neighbor are we, right? And how we are using our capital, our reputational resources, our material resources to support the community more broadly, right? So that's where a lot of the relationships come in. And then lastly, there is creative development, which is a reframed thinking of education, which not only centers the inclusion, diversity, equity, and access values, but then also seeks to have a fully articulated through line between starting with, the youngest folks. We have operas for babies, literally, and then going all the way through to our resident artist program, right? And then actually thinking about the pipeline. What do we need to do as a company so that we are actually putting more underrepresented folks into a pipeline that will have a broader effect on what the field is doing? So it's a general shift from we're just producing world-class opera to being a part of a community of practice and an actual geographic community where we are substantively using our resources to shift how the company is seen and how people think of opera, honestly.
Thank you, Lee. Yeah, that's so important. Putting our money where our mouth is when it comes to these conversations often shows the highest level of commitment in some ways. David, in terms of process and strategy, can you take us back to that moment when you were trying to explain to your board why buying a management company was a risk that the school should take?
Yeah, it was interesting because I think it seemed from my point of view to be a a solution that could meet several challenges we were faced with, because as you know, we were in the process of dealing with the pandemic as well as Black Lives Matter. And we were taking on serious questions of how to redress all these issues. And for a while, I'd actually sketched the idea of acquiring a management company long before the pandemic came along. When it came along, I said, listen, the management companies are going to collapse. One of the challenges is, not that by any stretch of the imagination, even 1% of your students go under management ultimately, but let's just look at who ends up under management, how that happens. And there's a stage where young artists need to be shepherded. They really do. And if we imagine not just that being a series of apprentice positions that we would endow that they could manage and co-present, but what if we also said this has to have a DEI mission attached to it? That part of this is fusing the need to shepherd artists with us being sure the world sees these artists that they should be seeing. What if we bring these ideas together and at the same time preserve the last, what turned out to be remaining management company in North America of this size, as Cami then ultimately did, unfortunately succumb to the pressures of the pandemic. The board was, fortunately, been very successful. I've been here for quite some time. It's my end of my 9th year. We were also, by the way, I should point out, building a $205 million facility that all the supply chains were shutting down. And we had loan debt coming due where students had to be living in dorms, but no one was allowed to be living on campus. So I want to point out that it was, the board really looked at me and said, you do know that we have like $200 million at risk over here. So are you sure that this may be the right focus of our time? I said, if we don't use this crisis to lead change, I think we'll have lost opportunity. And I fundamentally believe that, ultimately the results we can achieve from doing this make the greatest difference. In the end, it was because I'd built enough trust with the board to take them along with us. And to their great credit as a board, they were committed to these issues. They knew the students needed support. They knew that we needed to address DEI, and they knew that they were concerned about even the future of the profession itself. So I think for them, even though it was scary, I think it would have been more frightening to do nothing. Because I think what you feel in that mode is helplessness. So I think from my point of view, the activity in a way of taking the risks helps stave off some of the feeling of helplessness. And I was thinking about, I remember that there was a wonderful write-up in the New Yorker of the Wagner. I just want to tell you, I thought, what a fantastic, but I was thinking about that and I said, this is precisely, the kind of thing we should see happening because it gives us hope. So in the end, I think the board chose hope over fear. But as leaders, we have to build enough of a relationship with our board members, I think, and our communities to be able to take them on the path of hope and hope that they stay with them.
Can I jump in there, Jazmín?
Yes,
just to say, David, thank you so much. That was such a nice comment about Twilight Gods. But it strikes me as exactly why we do what we do. It's, we're not trying to speak in a bubble. We're not trying to speak in isolation. I love the fact that someone can read about artists coming together to still create an opera during the pandemic and figure out a way to do it and actually create something that was, my favorite comment was when people said, I would have loved this even if there was no COVID. It wasn't like an apology, like we can't be in our big, beautiful theater. So we're so sorry that all we can offer you are these dregs of an idea, half-heartedly realized, whatever. So instead of that, something that really did say we, create, art finds a way and creativity finds a way. And what that can do to inspire even people who really are not even interested in opera, who might think opera is not for them. I hope that everyone would give opera a chance, and that's certainly a big part of what I try to do. But nonetheless, if the conversation just stays in the aesthetic realm of just opera, I don't know. I feel like we have to question why we do what we do, if that's the case. We really need it. What we do should offer inspiration, meditation, so many different things that the arts offer us that go beyond just the appreciation of individual talent, but more that inspiring people to be able to think differently.
Right.
And realize that another path is always possible, even when it seems like there's no options.
Right.
Absolutely. And Yuval, actually, I'd love to ask a quick follow-up that came from our audience that I think aligns pretty nicely with the concept of process here, especially in the artistic process. And that question is, how do you integrate, how do you manage the artistic vision for change versus the composer's intent? I think Bowen might have sparked this.
Yeah, I'm sure, and I'm sure it's I'm sure it's gonna spark some really interesting conversation when we finally do it in April. But you know, I'm a director, stage director first and foremost, before I got really involved in the producing side of things and the administrative side of things. So I like to think that one of the things that actually is opera's best chance for the future is to realize that these are not stable and fixed works that are once and for all set in stone and then merely get, you know, you add water and stir, as I like to sometimes say, you know, and La Boheme actually suffers a lot from this, which is like, okay, it's going to be the garret with the window and the moon and the this and the that. And it's just, you know, yeah, I went for my staff here in Detroit, I showed pictures of, you know, our last La Boheme, next to a picture from San Francisco Opera's La Boheme versus the Met's La Boheme versus, and then I can't remember the other ones. But anyway, they all looked exactly the same, you know, and they all, you know, you would not be able to tell what was distinctly Detroit about our version of La Boheme. And I think that is, I actually think that's to the detriment of the composers, because you are in a way saying that what they have said is done. What they have said belongs to a period of time, and you'll have to infer relevance. You'll have to infer anything about why we still do it, as opposed to this is in theater and all the other performing arts. This is already totally accepted, totally accepted mindset that there's an active interpretation each and every time you do it. That the composer's intent lives in black and white on the dots that she or he left on the page. And it's up to all of the interpreters to figure out what that means and why you do it again, not just because that's how it was done. Even 5 years ago, you know, as time changes, these works actually have a tremendous ability to change with us. And I think that opera's been resistant to that. I think, you know, there is a sort of fidelity, and maybe, you know, I don't think it's misplaced. I just think that the notion of fidelity gets in the way of us really treating these works as if they really are contemporaries. And so, that's the kind of path I'm on in Detroit, where it is a mix of repertoire, both classic repertoire and some new works. You know, the next piece we'll do after Boheme is a major new production of Anthony Davis's opera X, on the life and times of Malcolm X. And for me, these two pieces back to back, these two new productions that we're doing straight out of the pandemic and into two new productions, to me encapsulates what I think really excites me about opera's future, is that the classic works have a flexibility that we need to absolutely take advantage of. And there are masterworks that are being written right now that need to be treated at the level that we treat the Puccinis, the Verdis, and the Wagners. So in many ways, this Boheme and subsequently the Malcolm X opera, these are, to me, a statement of principles where I'd like to see opera go forward in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Yuval. I want to, you know, name that we are now 2 years removed from the sort of initial surprise, the shock of the major events that we're living through, both with the pandemic and a racial reckoning in our country, and ask about ways that you are maintaining energy around the wild ideas that materialized maybe now over 1.5 to 2 years ago, and what advice you have for those in our audience who are perhaps in change-making positions or have change-making intentions within their institution, how they may work to create lasting systemic change from within an institution or with an individual artistic practice or whatever that vantage point may be. Let's see, David, you want to kick us off there?
Sure. I think, you know, lasting change is the key. And I think we also have to recognize that, you know, ultimately we steward these institutions. The key I find is how do we try to, as much as we can, alter their DNA in such a way that they replicate the things that we think are really important. And In that way, over the time, I've discovered that you need to structurally create mechanisms which then require change to continue. I'm going to say that again. You have to structurally insert and create mechanisms which require change to continue. And the big thing is getting people to move around from looking behind us in the past and looking forward. I mean, even the questions like we think about a composer's intent in an opera, which I think you've always such a great answer. I would point out, many composers I know, if their opera is performed a second time, they'd be thrilled. Yes. Now, if 100 years from now, someone were to reverse all the acts, but they're, you performed my opera, I'm not sure that I think they might say this is great. Same thing. What would they do if they had the technology we have today for theaters? A lot of the things that we worship at the altar of certain performances. And I'm saying that because when I think about how we're preparing students, I think part of it is how do you put in structural changes? So for us, it wasn't just are we going to respond to DEI, but how to respond to DEI and, let's say, loan debt for students. And as we are adding more and more full ride, instead of just simply saying we're giving you full tuition, we connect it to a service component. So as we raise the scholarships, you have to do scholarship and service. The service component is that you work as a teacher in one of the schools that we now have created here, either in, at the basement of the Third Baptist Church over here, or in Oakland with the Young Person's Choral Orchestra, or the East Bay Performing Arts Center. That's your service component. Now you're working with children in highly diverse communities coming from highly varied backgrounds as a musician and learning about that. But the structural change is the scholarship is actually restricted. It includes that purpose to it. You see. So at a certain point, as that endowment grows, that mission must continue, and the mission has to realize itself through these ways. In that way, I see it as these students, and the thing about our institution, in fact, all of our conservatories, is that we often talk about the fact, 40% of our students come from Asia. So when they arrive in America and we're dealing with a crisis of race in this country, you have often Chinese students saying, I couldn't imagine talking about the atrocities I've seen in my nation because I may disappear. I mean, literally, that's true. And that comes up in the classes we have. So, we have this very interesting insertion of international ideas coming into a space we're dealing with a domestic maelstrom of issues. And so how do we make that productive? Well, by connecting people. So scholarship and service puts our students into these communities, and it means that they are redressing in real time these issues. That's one thing. 10 years of emerging Black composers requires us and the symphony to do this for 10 years, right? The next phase of this was when we thought about the Young Artist Program at Opus 3, again, we're endowing those positions, and again, we're adding the DEI component as part of what the endowment does. So I think you have to imagine not allowing the choices you make now to land on the surface of a structure without the actual structure being penetrated. And I mean that from the business platform of how the institution actually works. And that's where, if you're in my role or an equivalent role as the president, you have to structure budget alignments, endowment growth, and everything to include the principles of what you seek to achieve. And just as an idea, I would suggest that's the best thinking I personally possess right now about how to try and push change beyond the moment. And I'm hoping that this will work. I want to be clear that, we're taking steps, we believe it'll work, but, it's staying with it and having the discipline to stay with it that makes the biggest difference. So I'll stop there, but those are some ideas I have about how to sustain structural change.
Yes, so many wonderful tidbits there. I mean, these structural changes live in the budget. You're absolutely right about that, David. And they live with your funders and with the sort of expectations that comes from your funders, but also from your own program, from building it with that intention. Yeah, so much good stuff there. I hope everyone is taking notes in the audience. Lee, how about you?
Sure. So I think it's a two-part piece, right? First, you actually have to acknowledge that we are in a moment where things are shifting. And I think that in and of itself can be a challenge for a lot of organizations. But our future as a medium is really tied to being able to get in front of these demographic shifts, some of which are racial and ethnic, some are which are around gender identity, and then some are just purely generational, right? Millennials and Zoomers have a very different orientation to a lot of the sort of structures that our companies are built on, like the idea that someone is going to leave much of their wealth to an arts organization is not something that my generation holds on to, right? So you take these pieces and then you overlay a sense of what are the barriers to participation for the various groups. You literally can go through and laundry list them and then recognize that the moment that we're in right now is one of action, right? So even taking some small actions in these areas can really shift how folks understand what your organization is going to do. So I'll give just a couple examples from Minnesota, right? Thinking about the concert hall itself as a barrier for a lot of people of color, some people from low income backgrounds, right? And then moving productions out of that space, right? So one of the places that we've moved to is doing opera in the outfield, quite literally. So we've performed at the baseball stadium, we've performed at the Major League Soccer stadium. The Major League Soccer stadium production was one that centered Latinx culture. So it featured all Latinx singers and composers, and also centered the cultural history and musicians as well. Another one is Miniatures, which is one of the two composers cohorts that I mentioned. This one focused very much on Minnesota composers from underrepresented backgrounds, right? And really seeking out people who have an interest in writing for the opera, who have come from other disciplines, and both supporting them through the creation process, but also giving them an orientation where we're learning as much about what they want to do and how they see their art taking form, and then representing that to audiences in a way where we are moving beyond this idea that every single person who ever could create an opera was alive 300 years ago and lived in Europe, right? Like that as a barrier. And then also other programs like the land acknowledgement, right? We exist on the land of the Dakota people here in the Twin Cities. There is a very active Indigenous population, but it's not enough for this to be a static line on the website. So we built out an entire program that centers service activities, educational workshops, and organizational partnerships with various Indigenous-run groups in the area that really reframe the company's relationship to the land, but then also centers some of the values that are so important to Indigenous communities. And it's a way of saying, we're here to represent you as well, right? And we have to be able to do that in the art, but also in how we engage with each other, lest we find ourselves in a situation where it's just a black box on Instagram, right? Like it's really thinking about how people experience us as a civic organization.
Absolutely. Yes. I think there's also a delicate balance between making these long-term commitments that can also sometimes feel static. And, if it is a 10-year commitment down the line, I sometimes also think like, what if this is, allowing room to continue to innovate within those 10 years and shift and, realign the projects as they respond to changing environments. We're going to be in a completely different place in 10 years. And so 20 years down the line. So leaving room to continue to listen to our community and the communities that we seek to serve and be responsive to that. So important. Thank you, Lee. Yuval, from an artistic point of view, how do you also maintain your commitment to anti-racism, to EDI, from the viewpoint as an artistic director? I know casting must come up a lot in that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, casting, of course, is something that is a very easy one, for which to address more equity and more representation as we see it on stage. Because that is literally who we see on stage. It's who we see perform. So I would think that that's a given for any opera company right now. What I'm interested in Detroit is taking that as the given and saying, of course, that's going to happen. But let's go past that. What stories are happening on our stage? I think, Lee, to your point, which was it's so exciting to think about all of the composers that you're supporting that are bringing in new vocabularies into what opera is about, new musical ideas, new language. And so I'm really trying to think a lot about the directors that are going to be my colleagues in Detroit. Who else will be directing next? I'll have my projects, but I'm not directing Malcolm X. Robert O'Hara is directing the Malcolm X opera. Keneza Shaw directed Blue for us in September at the Aretha Franklin Amphitheater. And of course, there's not just the directors. I don't mean to sound like a director by constantly centering my own practice, but that just happens to be my own personal avenue into all of this. But who's conducting? Who is conducting? Is that showing the right kind of representation and giving another cultural perspective? Whether it's an Italian opera, American opera, Latin American opera, whatever. It's like there are so many. That's one of the things that is really great about opera. There are so many platforms. So it's this. The singers feels like that's a great way to really telegraph to your audience that representation is going to be happening. But I want to go past that, and I want to go into all of the other elements that make up opera and make sure that equity is there. And of course it has an extraordinarily important social meaning to do this, but beyond that, it is just without question that it makes the art richer. I mean, there is just no way that you can, and for me, it's always, it's like, I really think for the last 5 or 6 years, the creative teams that I've worked with, my own mind has always been expanded whenever I've been working with somebody that comes from a different perspective, that's had a different life experience based on their cultural background. Whether they are American or whether they're European or African or depending on where their backgrounds are, we all come together and find a consensus for what it is that we want to create together. And that is a really beautiful social model. And every single time that I've done that, the work has been stronger. So to me, it is by all means a social imperative, but I think it's artistically an incredibly rich field that we're only starting to see happen in the field of opera, at least.
Thank you, Yuval. As we know, the theme of this year's conference is forging alliances. And so I really want to make sure that we each get an opportunity to talk about some of the partnerships and alliances that have been crucial to our advancement of new ideas in the field. Lee, you have spoken at length, I think, about some really interesting partnerships that you're working on in Minnesota. Are there one or two that come to mind as particularly exemplary that we might be able to learn something from here today?
Sure. So one of the partnerships or the sets of partnerships that I'm really excited about has to do with accessibility, specifically physical accessibility into our various performance venues and also the Opera Center itself where we work. So we brought together 4 individuals who represent different organizations that we recognize are either really important advocates for people with disabilities or that themselves have sophisticated apparatuses that have been built out to be able to be in conversation with communities of folks with disabilities, right? And we have brought these people into our organizational planning to help advise us around what we need to do relative to our own operations, but then also to help us break out of our own thinking, right? So often we're interpreting this as being about Braille signs or wheelchair ramps and not understanding that there's so many other pieces to how individuals can experience our company, right? So what is on our website? Who is able to access that? Program notes that appear in the programs, right? Things like the patron code of conduct, really thinking about every single aspect of the company, how people experience it, and then really looking to other organizations that know more than we do to help us think through how do we do this and how do we do this in an intersectional way. We are really great with understanding how to put on a world-class production. But what we don't necessarily know, right, is how these things are experienced by lots of different individuals who aren't represented in the ranks of the employees of our company. So that's been a longer term piece. It started as a single conversation, and now we understand that these are relationships that need to continue perhaps in perpetuity, as we recognize that this is also something that shifts, right? And moving more to the virtual space, for instance, it's just shifted what these conversations are and who is a part of them. And I've been really, really grateful for the knowledge that they've brought to us, and excited that there are more individuals now who can experience what it is that we're doing without the trauma of having to negotiate, while these folks were really not thinking about the needs of people like me when they were producing whatever they were producing.
Absolutely. What a gift to partner with experts, right? Who you can rely on to know the right thing, and that doesn't fall solely on your shoulders or the people within the organization. It's always such a relief in that way. Thank you, Lee. That's beautiful. Let's see, Yuval, what kind of partnerships and alliances have been interesting in your work these days?
You know, in Detroit, it's been great to learn about the community here in Detroit, to really think about what kind of projects I want to be offering, but also thinking about projects that happen off our main stage, like what we've been doing for the last year. And the partnerships have been really, really, I think, really robust in terms of helping make sure that what we're talking about on stage doesn't just remain in the realm of the theater, but go out into the community in really exciting ways. And so I've been really grateful for both. Also, our staff here in Detroit does this extremely well, and reminds me that, you know, arts institutions, you know, that we're there to be part of a community, and the more that we can connect to the community, invite them in, and also be part of their offerings, is just such a great way to truly integrate this art form that I think even here in Detroit still has a lot of barriers in terms of the image of elitism and sometimes the act of elitism, we have to be honest, you know. So really trying to take away those barriers through that connection to, I think in Detroit, I've been really excited about working with the Charles Wright Museum. You know, Sphinx has been an amazing partner. You know, in so many ways. I know AFA is listening, so hi AFA. It's you know, it's been beyond the larger institutions, but also something I've been thinking about a lot as I think about my next projects that I want to do in Detroit, is some of the incredible nonprofit organizations that are doing social justice work, but also environmental justice, and that there's an incredible movement here in Detroit for that, for environmental justice that I find very exciting and very obviously very urgent, and thinking about how that might impact what we do on stage. Thinking about the greening of our production processes, you know, so that we are actually being mindful. You know, opera sometimes is, as we all know, a very extravagant art form, which can lead to a lot of wastefulness. And we're clearly in a time where we need to really be thinking about how we use all our resources. So, so I feel like I'm just getting started in many ways, but it is exciting to think beyond. Of course, it's always also great to have the performing arts groups that are partnering. So I don't want to minimize that. It's really exciting that both Bohem and X are going to be co-productions with major companies across the country, so that the work that's happening in Detroit is now going to be exported in a way that hasn't happened in its 50-year history. So that's super exciting. But just from the artistic point of view, and in terms of the sense of the impact of the work that we do, that's kind of where my head is right now, is just thinking about those other nonprofit organizations throughout Detroit that are really trying to make the city and the state and the country a better place to live in, and how art can be part of that.
Thank you, Yuval. David, I think to the envy of many independent conservatories, you have successfully brokered a partnership with your symphony orchestra, which is, I mean, such a feat. But are there any other partnerships or alliances that have surprised you, or have functioned in a way that you think we might take something away from it?
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, for our partners at the Civic Center, it's been terrific. And I'll just illustrate some quick snapshots of the ones we enjoy. Yes, there's a substantial partnership with the symphony, and I think that we're beginning to have our values align. I think the Conservatory can leap ahead to a value system sometimes. The symphony takes longer, I'll be honest, but I think they're getting there. SF Jazz is a great partner. For example, the SF Jazz Collective comes to town. When we started the Roots Jazz American Music program, we made them a central piece of our faculty in exchange for having our students perform side by side with them 4 times a year in the SF Jazz Center, right? So that is a fantastic way for those artists in the collective have more income. Our students have an unparalleled experience. Everybody wins. And I think that's always the key of a great partnership is everybody wins. Same thing for the opera, the Marilla and the Adler program now. We are appointing faculty. We appoint them full-time, but they're cross-appointed in all 3 organizations. And then we also attach that to the outreach efforts I was talking about in our DEI initiatives. That's another fantastic partnership. I can't say enough about, this is now in its 6th year, 7th year, our partnership with the Third Baptist Church, where we run our Bridge to Art music program. Yeah, you have to love this. It was a partnership that started with Temple Emmanuel, the synagogue, the Third Baptist Church, right, with Reverend Amos Brown, who was the last student of Dr. Martin Luther King. And then it also involved the District Board of Supervisors, San Francisco, and us. Talk about a hodgepodge, motley crew. And now we run this free program for kids and the Yamaha Corporation. Forgive me, they gave us all the instruments. But successfully, we brought everybody together to give, really quite a few students who had no music programs in their schools anymore. They give us the space. We provide the instruments. Our students make money being instructors with someone we've hired through grants, also from the Corrette Foundation, I should say that. So here is, in many respects, and the synagogue, by the way, in Third Baptist swap on MLK Day. The pastor goes up, Reverend Brown goes up to the synagogue, and the rabbis come down to the Baptist church, and they switch pulpits. And maybe that's just in San Francisco that things are this progressive, but I'm simply saying, it does illustrate for us how great these partnerships can be. So I can't say enough about what happens there, because the other thing that happens is you do have values conversations, because in the end, you have to share mission objectives. You have to be overt about what you're trying to achieve together. And I think if everybody comes into it, they're recognizing that in the nonprofit world, whenever our corporate egos get involved, that's when we're about to lose. I mean, I come back. We are stewards of these organizations, okay? It's not, the more we can think about the fact that every time we bring a nonprofit partner close to us and we all thrive together, that works. The reason that stands in the way more often than not, which is a fallacy, is a belief that there's a finite amount of fundraising to be had. And somehow if you partner, someone might steal your donors. And I will tell you right now, this is real. This comes, and no one says it out loud in the room. Hear me now, everybody. No one says it out loud in the room, but that's what everybody is thinking at the time. It is completely and utterly false. In fact, the reverse is true. When you start to partner and share resources and achieve larger objectives, more fundraising happens for all of the organizations. When you start to partner, more fundraising happens. It is an illusion to believe that it becomes lesser, because the donors are impressed that you're sharing resources, working together to accomplish larger goals. So I would simply say the partnerships have been terrific. On the other hand, I've had 9 years to work on it. Please, it takes that long, folks. It takes, sometimes we think, what have you done? We're 100 days in. 9 years. And so sometimes we often forget, you have to think about these places and how much of a decade are you prepared to give if you really want to achieve these goals. And that's the kind of investment it takes. So I'll stop there again, but so I think we enjoy it. And then of course, Opus 3 is a wonderful partner at this point as well.
Thank you, David. That is so important. Everything you've named here. I think everyone's notebooks are filling up quite rapidly in the comment section. Okay, let's take one final question as we wrap up. Let's see. So how would you describe the internal culture that has been fostered to make these wild changes? I'm especially interested in hearing how people work cross-departmentally and top-down. Great question. Any of our panelists would like to jump in?
I can say really briefly that at Minnesota, we took a period of a few months last year to start with the diversity charter that I mentioned, and then each unit made its own culture guide, which was intended to sort of define how each department would work within itself, right? But then we've been able to take a look at each of these and then think about how do we break down silos, right? So we have this really rich bit of information about how each department likes to work and perhaps what some of those pinch points are, and then we can use those to think differently about how we need to articulate a given thing in a given moment, right? So as you suggested earlier, Jazmín, like there's this way that you really do have to build towards consensus with lots and lots of decisions, and actually having the departments go through the process of talking about their own workflows is given a real sense of how you sort of formulate arguments that allow you to move through things more quickly through the organization, especially new and unusual or challenging decisions that really shift how we work together or how we've worked in the past.
What a brilliant model. Thank you for sharing that, Lee. David or Yuval, anything to add there?
I would just say that I think that it's really important to build consensus, but I would say as the president, it's really important for the leader of an organization to stand up and say we're going to do something.
Totally.
You have to be prepared to be accountable for change, and you have to make a statement how important change is, because not everybody is going to agree with you. And that includes people in your community and the board. I don't think you have to go so far as to specify but you have to identify certain principles that need to be met, and then you have to be sure that that process happens. And what I'm saying is that's very different than saying, and I'll give you two examples. I believe we need to do the following things versus clearly we have a challenge in the world today that we need to respond to as a community. So I'm very pleased to announce today that I'm going to begin an effort here within our organization of departments talking to one another as we begin to examine how it is we might respond to X. You've heard, okay, so I will simply say you want to look for something that isn't the voice of a dictator, but is the voice of accountability, that it's my job to be sure change is happening. I'm committed to see changes happening. You should hold me accountable for change. And then I'm going to work with all of my colleagues at the board level within this community to be sure that we see an outcome here. And that's the balancing point. So in my view, that's always where change has to begin in some level. The one person you want to recruit to your team immediately, you need just one other person as the president, that's the board chair. Lessons from the wilderness, yes. Get the board chair on board and then go. Not so far as to eliminate people's ability to contribute, because the more people can contribute to what the solution is, the more investment you will have. So it's that fine balance of commitment, but space. But commitment, space, timeline, here's the accountability report. You will hear from us on this date at this time, clear measures of I'm giving us a plan because at the end I expect these kinds of results at this time. So anyway.
Yes, and what beautiful magic can happen when all of those things can be activated at once, right? The internal systems where folks are on the day-to-day keeping each other accountable, but also at the leadership and board level, having that level of support. Yeah, that sounds like so many amazing things can materialize from that synergy. Yes. Okay, and we have just over a minute to go but there's a final question of how do you catalyze energy without experiencing burnout? If anyone wants to share a quick self-care tip here with our audience as we continue on in this work collectively here. What is something you rely on?
I don't think I can answer that. I don't think I can answer that question, but I will, if I can just jump in, and I just want to echo what David just said about leadership, finding this balance between, it's tough because, trying to think collaboratively and trying to think, especially opera, in my opinion, being such a collaborative art form, you still, it doesn't discount, and in many ways, I think we can look at what's been happening in our country and seeing what a difference in leadership makes, in terms of the health and safety of our country, So leadership matters, and that does not mean dictatorship. Like there is, I think, David, you put it so well, that there is a middle ground in which leadership is clear and strong, and yet it allows for people to still be who they are. The right kind of leadership empowers everybody.
Right.
So I think trying to find that, and maybe there's also an answer there to escape burnout, but I don't know. That I'll leave that to anyone else to respond to.
I might add that two things that I think can be really helpful is, one, transparency in every conversation with the reality that the systems of inequality that exist in the opera took hundreds of years to create. So no single activity, consultant, hire will fix all of them, right? And just let that be the starting point. And then making sure that you are choosing attainable, measurable, sequential goals along the way that allow people to feel a momentum that this is working in the right direction. Because otherwise, I do think it feels like this endless stream of challenges that none of us will be around to see everything corrected, right? So I think if you can have that honesty about what this actual project is long term, I think it does help folks to understand we're in this for the long haul.
Yeah, I mean, Jazmín, I would say is what's great about at least being mostly back in person is being around the students. As you know, I think being around the students always energizes me to remind me why I need to stay energetic and focused, because they're excited. You know, they have this incredibly optimistic view, and it's great to be at this stage of life and be able to look through their eyes at the world, because it does energize you if they're feeling optimistic. But I want to come back to something you said, Lee, that I think is so important about, you know, that's not just saying if we have this initiative or this hire and gee, now we've addressed it, because it is hundreds of years. And you know, one of the things we were making these changes, we had a convocation around diversity, equity, and inclusion to kick off the year. And, you know, Jason Hainsworth, our associate dean, was there, who oversees DEI. And I said, listen, you know, Dean Hainsworth is amazing. And so we look at it and we might say, okay, now we have our solution. But, you know, it's not that he has this, it's that we have this. You know, it's a question of seeing this as we have to hold ourselves accountable. And I do think in that mode, if you can stay in that we mode as much as you're leading, the energy comes from everybody else helping everybody else to remain optimistic. You know, I depend on everyone around the institution for me to feel optimistic, because then it gives me the energy to do my job and catalyze energy I need to respond exactly to this question, to make change, because it's not easy. I think it would be a real misrepresentation to suggest that this is glamorous or that, you know, it's hard work, but it's very rewarding. So I think it's, you know, trying to find energy in the reward while recognizing it can be difficult, and those of us head organizations are going to take a lot of criticism. We're sometimes fair or unfair. We're going to sit in the chair. You know, you're the face of the organization for all of its wins and all of its sins. And you have to be prepared to accept all of that, you know, all 103 years of it at the time when it comes at you. But the people around you, if they believe in you, I think you'll feel optimistic.
Indeed. Thank you so much, David, Yuval, and Lee, for joining for this wonderful conversation. And thank you, Sphinx audience. We will see you in subsequent sessions. Everyone have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jazmín. Great job.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.